The ship had been dead for 3 days before the human admitted it. Not out loud, not to any log or system. Those had stopped listening long ago. But in the quiet, private way, a human accepts loss when denial has finally exhausted itself. The engines were cold. The auxiliary power was gone. The stars outside the fractured viewport no longer shifted relative to one another, which meant inertia had claimed what little momentum remained. The vessel drifted now, a metal corpse tumbling slowly through a region of space that did not belong to any charted empire, trade lane, or myth with commercial value. The distress beacon had burned itself out 2 days earlier. The human remained alive anyway. He had sealed compartments manually, rationed air by instinct rather than protocol, and overridden safety interlocks that had been designed under the assumption that no one would ever need to ignore them. He had slept in 20-minute intervals, curled against bulkheads that still held trace warmth, waking before hypoxia could claim too much ground. His hands were burned. His left shoulder no longer responded correctly. He had lost blood, fluids, and one of his boots, though he could not remember exactly when that had happened. None of that mattered as much as the fact that he was still thinking. That, more than anything else, was why he survived long enough for the alien scanners to find him. On the bridge of the survey vessel Althrex of quiet measure, the beings who would one day argue about whether humans were a cosmic anomaly or an inevitable outcome noticed the signal as a statistical irregularity. Not a distress call. That frequency band had been obsolete for several thousand of their local cycles, but a pattern of electromagnetic noise that suggested intentional modulation. Something, somewhere inside that drifting wreck, was still altering its environment. The Althrex did not approach immediately. They watched. They observed a species that should have been unconscious adjusting pressure valves by hand. They recorded thermal spikes where no power source should have existed. They detected repeated, inefficient attempts to restart a fusion cascade using methods that violated several principles the Althrex considered axiomatic. The vessel should have detonated. It did not. The human compensated, again and again. Eventually, curiosity overcame caution. When the Althrex boarding team cut their way into the ship, they expected to find either a corpse or a barely sentient organism clinging to the final reflexes of life. What they found instead was a human sitting upright against the remains of a control console, one eye swollen shut, the other focused sharply on the breach point. He raised his remaining hand. "Hey," he said, his voice hoarse, his pronunciation mangled by dehydration. "You folks wouldn't happen to have a spare power cell, would you?" The Althrex paused. This was not how first contact was supposed to go. They took him aboard. That part later historians would agree was the first mistake. The Althrex believed in containment, in observation before interference. They placed the human in a biosecure environment and monitored his recovery with clinical detachment. Their medical systems worked slowly, carefully, unwilling to shock his biology too abruptly. The human healed anyway, faster than projected. Scars formed where tissue should have failed. Bone knit together under conditions that would have required regeneration vats for an Althrex citizen. The human slept. When he woke, he asked questions. He wanted to know where he was, who they were, how far they were from anything he might recognize. He wanted to know what year it was relative to known galactic standards, and when told those standards did not apply, he asked how long a cycle was in seconds. He accepted answers without panic. When no answers were available, he speculated aloud, filling the silence with reasoning that jumped intuitive gaps the Althrex preferred to map methodically. They began recording more closely. The Althrex were an old species, not ancient in the way of myth, but old enough to have forgotten what it felt like to be uncertain about their place in the universe. Their technology was refined, stable, optimized. Their civilization valued equilibrium above all else. Systems were built to last, not to change. Risk was a variable to be minimized, never embraced. Humans, the Althrex would learn, did not share this instinct. The first indication came when the human, who identified himself simply as a technician, not a soldier or explorer, requested access to the ship's environmental controls. He had noticed a harmonic vibration in the life support systems, something subtle enough that Althrek's diagnostics had flagged it as background noise. To him, it sounded wrong. Given limited access, he improvised a fix using components not intended for that purpose. The vibration ceased. Energy efficiency improved by 3%. The Althrek's engineers were unsettled. When asked how he had known what to do, the human shrugged. "Didn't," he said. "Just knew what not to do." That answer did not satisfy their models. Over the following cycles, the human was allowed limited mobility. He explored the ship with curiosity rather than fear, asking about materials, energy flows, redundancies. He pointed out design choices that assumed perfect conditions and suggested alternatives that would function under failure. The Althreks listened, not because they trusted him, but because some of his suggestions worked. This, too, was unsettling. The turning point came when the Althreks survey vessel received a priority signal from their home system. The core, an artificial stellar construct that powered their civilization, was destabilizing. Energy output fluctuations had exceeded safe tolerances. Long-term models predicted collapse within 10 cycles. The Althreks had contingency plans for everything except this. The core was sacred, not in a religious sense, though some older cultural residues lingered, but in a structural one. It was the foundation upon which their society had been built. No one alive remembered a time before it. No one was permitted to alter its internal architecture. Maintenance was external only, governed by strict protocols designed to preserve equilibrium. Those protocols were failing. The Althreks engineers convened councils, ran simulations, adjusted peripheral systems. None of it addressed the underlying issue. The core was aging in ways they had not anticipated. Its original designers were long gone. The documentation incomplete. The system was too complex to be shut down, too vital to be allowed to fail. When the human overheard fragments of this discussion, he did something unexpected. He laughed. Not mockingly, not cruelly, just a short, incredulous sound like someone hearing a familiar problem described in an unfamiliar language. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that the thing keeping your entire civilization alive is failing. Nobody's allowed to touch it, and your plan is to what? Hope it stabilizes out of respect." The Althreks did not appreciate the phrasing. They explained patiently that intervention carried unacceptable risk, that the core's internal dynamics were poorly understood, that altering them could accelerate collapse. The human nodded. "Yeah," he said, "that's usually how it goes." When asked what he meant, he explained in terms they struggled to map. He spoke of machines that were too big to fail, of systems built without exit strategies, of civilizations that mistook stability for permanence. He spoke of reactors jury-rigged in emergencies, of engineers crawling into spaces no one was meant to enter because the alternative was worse. He spoke of doing the dangerous thing because doing nothing was also a choice. The Althreks did not like this reasoning, but the core continued to destabilize. Eventually, desperation overcame doctrine. A delegation approached the human with a proposal framed as a question but carrying the weight of a plea. Would he examine the core? Not intervene, just observe, offer perspective. The human agreed immediately. The core was beautiful. That was the human's first observation upon seeing it. Not its scale, though it dwarfed anything he had worked on before, nor its complexity, though it made his head ache to comprehend. It was beautiful in the way only functional things could be, layers of purpose built upon one another, humming with restrained power. It was also wrong. The human felt it before he understood it. A tension in the system, a feedback loop that had been dampened for so long it had begun to eat itself. The Althreks had optimized for efficiency, smoothing out fluctuations, eliminating redundancy in the name of balance. Over time, that balance had become brittle. "You've got no slack," the human said quietly. "No room for error. Everything's tuned too tight." The Althreks protested. Tight systems were efficient. Efficient systems were stable. "Until they're not," the human replied. "Then they shatter." He requested permission to adjust a minor subsystem, something small, reversible. The Althrex refused. Even small changes could propagate unpredictably. So the human asked a different question. What happens if you do nothing? Silence followed. The answer, unspoken, was extinction. The decision, when it came, was not unanimous. Some argued the human was reckless, his species untested, his methods primitive. Others pointed out that their own methods were failing. In the end, the vote passed by the narrowest margin allowable under Althrex law. The human was allowed into the core. He entered wearing protective gear that was, by Althrex standards, laughably insufficient. Radiation levels spiked. Thermal gradients fluctuated wildly. The human adapted, modifying his suit on the fly, rerouting coolant, overriding alarms. He moved with purpose, not reverence, treating the core not as a sacred object but as a machine that could be understood. He found the problem at the heart of it, a cascade failure waiting to happen, held at bay by constant micro-adjustments that masked deeper instability. The fix, as he saw it, was not delicate. It was violent. He proposed introducing controlled inefficiency, intentional losses that would bleed off excess energy, create buffers, allow the system to breathe. The Althrex recoiled at the idea. Waste was anathema, inefficiency a flaw to be eradicated. Your core is choking, the human said. You need to let it be messy. They argued. Time ran out. The human acted. He bypassed safeguards, rerouted flows, introduced feedback paths that would have been forbidden under any Althrex protocol. The core screamed, not audibly but in the language of sensors and alarms. Energy levels spiked. Structural integrity wavered. The Althrex prepared evacuation procedures. The human stayed. He rode the system through the chaos, making adjustments faster than their models could update, relying on intuition honed by years of working with imperfect tools under imperfect conditions. He burned through shielding. He overloaded components. He let things break so they wouldn't explode. When it was over, the core was quieter than it had been in centuries. Output was lower, efficiency reduced. Stability, however, had returned. The human collapsed. He survived, though recovery took longer this time. The Althrex watched over him in silence, their understanding of the universe subtly, irrevocably altered. They had built a civilization on balance and control, and a human, broken, stubborn, and dangerously adaptable, had saved it by embracing imbalance. When the human woke, he found representatives waiting. They offered gratitude, resources, a place among them if he wished to stay. They asked what he wanted in return. The human considered this. Honestly, he said, maybe stop assuming you've got it all figured out. The Althrex recorded that statement for later analysis. Humanity's reputation spread from there, not as conquerors, not as gods, but as something far more unsettling. A species that survived by refusing to accept that systems were immutable, that danger was always to be avoided, that equilibrium was the highest good. They were problem solvers in a universe that preferred stasis. They were messy. They were resilient. And when the stars themselves began to fail, it was humanity the galaxy learned to fear and to call. The Althrex did not expel him after that. That decision alone caused more internal disruption than the core's near failure had. Althrex society was not designed for exceptions. It was designed for continuity. Individuals were interchangeable within function, roles inherited rather than invented. The human did not fit anywhere within their frameworks, which meant every interaction with him created a small but persistent error in their social equations. They tolerated it at first. He was given quarters near the engineering spires, monitored but not confined. He was asked carefully, formally, to explain what he had done to the core. He tried. He used metaphors, drew diagrams, dismantled components to show how stress accumulated in closed systems. The Althrex recorded everything, translated his words into probability trees and energy curves. They still did not truly understand. What they understood instead was outcome. The core no longer screamed. Energy fluctuations smoothed into predictable oscillations. Entire cities that had been preparing for shutdown resumed normal operation. Agricultural lattices stabilized. Deep space beacons came back online. The Althrex civilization, which had stood on the brink of a silent collapse, stepped back from the edge. And the cause of that salvation was a single human who treated their most sacred construct like a stubborn engine that needed to be kicked until it behaved. That frightened them. Fear, among the Althrex, did not manifest as panic. Manifested as distance. They reduced the human's access. They thanked him in formal ceremonies that carried no warmth. They began discussing, in councils closed to outsiders, whether humanity represented a long-term risk. If one human could so thoroughly disrupt their most carefully balanced system, what might 100 do? 1,000? What might an entire civilization built on that mindset unleash? The human noticed the change, of course. Humans always noticed shifts in social temperature. He did not confront them about it. He went on repairing things. Small things at first. A transporter relay that kept drifting out of phase. A habitation dome whose climate regulators oscillated too sharply between parameters. An observation array that had lost calibration centuries earlier but still functioned within acceptable margins. He fixed them all with the same philosophy. Introduce slack, allow failure modes, plan for the system to be wrong. Every fix made the Althrex infrastructure more robust. Every fix also made them more uncomfortable. The tipping point came when a message arrived from beyond Althrex-controlled space. Another civilization, distant, proud, and very nearly dead, was experiencing a catastrophic systems failure of their own. Their stellar harvest engine, a construct not unlike the Althrex core but scaled across an entire star, had begun to destabilize. Unlike the Althrex, they did not ask for help. They broadcast a warning instead, a final signal meant to mark their passing. The Althrex intercepted it. They listened in silence as the message repeated, a litany of regret and resignation encoded in radiation bursts. The civilization, known to the Althrex as the Virelian Compact, had been rivals once, then neighbors, then distant acquaintances. Trade had ceased generations ago. Diplomacy had withered into formality. Now the Virelians were dying. The Althrex councils convened. They debated whether intervention was appropriate. The Compact had not asked for assistance. Their failure was not an Althrex responsibility. Resources were finite. Risk remained unacceptable. The human heard the signal by accident, passing through a communications hub where the transmission played on loop for archival purposes. He stopped. He listened. He asked one question. Why aren't you going to help them? The Althrex representative assigned to supervise him explained patiently that intervention could destabilize their own systems, that the Virelian technology was incompatible, that attempting to fix an alien stellar engine carried too many unknowns. The human nodded slowly. Right, he said. So they're dead then. The statement was not an accusation. It was an observation. That night the human disappeared. He did not flee. There was nowhere to flee to. He simply walked into a hangar, accessed a maintenance craft barely capable of interstellar transit, and launched himself toward the Virelian system using calculations scribbled on a datapad. The Althrex realized what had happened only when long-range sensors detected an unauthorized departure. They did not pursue him. Officially, they declared him lost. An unfortunate anomaly. A reminder of the risks inherent in tolerating unpredictable elements. Unofficially, they watched. The journey should have killed him. The maintenance craft was never designed for extended travel. Its shielding was minimal. Its navigation suite primitive. The human spent days awake, manually correcting course, scavenging power from non-essential systems, sleeping in brief, desperate intervals. He jury-rigged radiation baffles out of spare plating. He reprogrammed environmental controls to prioritize oxygen over temperature, choosing cold over suffocation. By the time he reached the Virelian system, his hands shook constantly. The star itself was wrong. The harvest engine encasing it glowed unevenly, massive segments dark while others burned too bright. Energy bled into space in chaotic flares. Entire orbital habitats had already gone silent, their trajectories decaying. The Virelians did not respond to his hails, so he docked anyway. What he found inside the harvest engine was familiar in a way that made his chest ache. It was another perfect system tuned too tightly, another marvel built without forgiveness. Redundancies had been optimized away, safeguards layered upon safeguards until no one could act without violating doctrine. The violins he encountered were resigned. Their engineers spoke of fate, of the inevitability of entropy. They watched the human with detached curiosity as he tore open panels, crawled through maintenance shafts, and swore under his breath in a language none of them understood. "You cannot fix this," one of them said calmly. "The engine is too vast. The cascade is already in motion." The human looked at them, exhausted, furious. "Then why are you still standing here talking to me?" They did not have an answer. He worked until his vision blurred. He introduced inefficiencies, broke symmetry, forced energy through paths never meant to carry it. He shut down entire sections of the engine, sacrificing capacity to preserve structure. The star raged, then settled, then raged again. The violins watched their death sentence stretch into uncertainty. The final stabilization came at a cost. The human collapsed into unconsciousness inside the engine's core, his suit breached, his body battered by radiation and heat. When the violins carried him out, they believed he was dead. He was not. Humans, as it turned out, were difficult to kill when stubbornness outweighed biology. The violin compact survived, diminished but alive. Their star burned less brightly, their energy surplus gone, but their worlds remained habitable. They sent messages, urgent, disbelieving, reverent, into the surrounding regions of space. They spoke of a species that refused to accept extinction as a conclusion. They spoke of a single human who had torn their sacred machine apart and rebuilt it wrong enough to save them. The Untouchables received those messages. So did others. Across the galaxy, civilizations that had built their greatness on permanence began to notice a pattern. Whenever a system approached catastrophic failure, stellar engines, planetary shields, artificial ecologies, there were whispers of humans nearby, of improvisation, of survival bought at the cost of elegance. Not all reactions were welcoming. Some species barred human entry outright. Others classified them as hazardous phenomena. A few attempted to study them, to model their behavior, to predict their interventions. None succeeded. Humanity did not spread through conquest or colonization. They spread through necessity. They appeared where systems failed, where equations broke down, where survival demanded someone willing to crawl into the machinery and make it ugly enough to keep working. They were not always thanked. They were not always invited, but they were remembered. The human who had started it all eventually returned to Untouchable space, thinner, slower, carrying scars that would never fully heal. The Untouchables did not stop him. They did not greet him with ceremony either. They simply watched as he walked back into their engineering spires and began fixing things again. This time they listened more closely. They asked different questions. Not how do we preserve equilibrium, but what happens when equilibrium fails? The human smiled at that. It was a small smile, tired, human, and somewhere far beyond any single star or civilization, the universe continued doing what it had always done, breaking things. For the first time in a very long while, it had reason to be nervous. The shift did not happen all at once. Galaxies do not pivot on single moments any more than civilizations do. Change, when it comes, arrives as a slow accumulation of tolerated deviations, a protocol bent here, an exception granted there. A quiet admission, buried in internal records, that something once believed immutable had, in fact, been altered by a human with burned hands and insufficient respect for tradition. Among the Untouchables, this manifested first in language. Their engineering councils began using a new term, one that had no direct translation in any of their previous dialects. It described a state that was not failure, not stability, but survivable dysfunction. A condition where systems operated outside optimal parameters yet remained functional through adaptive intervention. The term was inelegant, a compound of words meaning roughly, that which should not work but does. Privately, some engineers called it the human margin. The human himself never asked for credit. He continued doing what he had always done, moving toward problems, fixing what he could, leaving when the work was done. He refused offers of status. He declined formal titles. When asked why he did not claim authority, he answered honestly. "Authority makes people listen," he said. "Listening makes them wait. Waiting gets people killed." That answer unsettled more than one council. As word spread, other species began testing the idea carefully. Not the humans themselves. There were still too few known, too scattered. But the philosophy they carried like a contagion. Engineers quietly reintroduced redundancies long ago optimized away. Emergency systems were designed to be used, not merely admired in simulations. Control hierarchies loosened, allowing individuals on the ground to make decisions that violated doctrine if circumstances demanded it. Not every civilization adapted in time. Some clung to perfection until it shattered in their hands. Their ruins became case studies, warnings etched into interstellar databases. In many of those records, a common annotation appeared near the end: human assistance unavailable or declined. Humanity, meanwhile, did not unify around this reputation. There was no grand council declaring a new galactic role. Humans remained what they had always been: fractured, argumentative, endlessly diverse. Some resented the expectation that they would intervene. Others embraced it with reckless enthusiasm. A few tried to monetize it, offering human problem-solving consultants to desperate worlds with mixed results. It was messy. It was very human. The original human, the one the Althrec still referred to internally as the catalyst, aged. Humans, unlike many spacefaring species, carried time in their bodies. His hair grayed. His movements slowed. Scars stiffened into chronic pain. He continued working anyway, adjusting his pace, relying more on experience than endurance. Younger humans began appearing around him, drawn by rumor or curiosity or the simple need to see if the stories were true. He taught them little in formal terms. Mostly, he let them watch. He showed them how to listen to machines, how to feel when a system was lying about its own stability. He taught them when to trust diagnostics and when to ignore them entirely. He emphasized one lesson above all others, repeated so often it became almost ritual. "Nothing works forever," he said. "If it matters, plan for it to fail." Some of those humans went on to become legends in their own right. Others died anonymously in the void, pushing failing systems just far enough for someone else to survive. Humanity's casualty lists grew quietly without fanfare. They accepted that cost. Other species struggled to understand this acceptance. To them, loss was a sign of miscalculation. To humans, it was evidence of effort. The galaxy adapted accordingly. By the time the first true interstellar crisis emerged, one that threatened multiple civilizations simultaneously, it was no longer controversial to request human involvement. It was simply prudent. Emergency charters were rewritten. Human liaisons embedded in crisis response teams. Their authority remained informal, but their influence undeniable. They were the ones sent in when models broke down. They were the ones allowed to break rules. And they were the ones who stayed behind when evacuation was the safer option. When the crisis passed, and it always did, one way or another, there would be reports, analyses, and commemorations. Inevitably, someone would ask the same question, voiced with equal parts awe and unease. Why do humans keep doing this? Those who had worked alongside them answered consistently. Because someone has to. In the end, that was the true legacy of humanity's emergence onto the galactic stage. Not strength. Not dominance. Not even ingenuity, impressive as that was. It was refusal. Refusal to accept that failure was final. Refusal to believe that systems were more important than lives. Refusal to stand aside simply because the risk was unacceptable. The universe remained vast, indifferent, and prone to breaking itself in spectacular ways. But now, scattered among the stars, there existed a species that treated that indifference as a challenge rather than a verdict. And that, the galaxy slowly learned, changed everything. The refusal did not come without consequences. There were failures that even humans could not outrun, crises that moved faster than improvisation, catastrophes so large that no amount of stubbornness could fully contain them. Humanity learned, painfully, that being the species willing to step into the machinery did not make them immune to being crushed by it. The galaxy learned something else. When humans failed, they failed loudly, visibly, and in ways that left behind instruction rather than silence. One such failure began in a region of space so old its stars burned thin and red, their fusion cycles stretched to the edge of viability. Civilizations there had survived for eons by layering technology upon technology, extracting usefulness from systems long past their natural lifespans. It was a fragile balance, but it had held, until it didn't. A chain reaction rippled through the region. Stellar dimming cascaded into power shortages into habitat collapse, collapse into mass displacement. Entire populations fled systems that had sustained their ancestors for longer than recorded history. Humans were called. They arrived in numbers larger than usual this time. Not fleets. Humanity still lacked the cohesion for that, but waves of independent ships, crews drawn by distress signals and grim reputation alike. Engineers, pilots, medics, generalists, people who were very good at making things last a little longer than they should. They stabilized some stars. They patched others just enough to allow evacuation. They failed to save many. The losses were heavy. When it was over, the region was quieter than before. Fewer lights, fewer voices on the long-range bands. Humans gathered their dead where possible and left markers where they could not. The rest of the galaxy watched, uncertain how to interpret what had happened. Some saw proof that humans were not, after all, the answer to entropy. Others saw something more troubling. Humans had known they could fail. They went anyway. That distinction mattered. In the aftermath, a new dynamic emerged. Civilizations began to plan not just for stability, but for intervention. Emergency architectures were redesigned to accommodate human methods. Access points where none would have been allowed before. Override systems deliberately left crude enough for manual control. Spaces within machines where a living being could physically enter and work. It was, in many ways, an admission of vulnerability. Humans noticed. They did not comment on it publicly, but among themselves, they recognized the shift. The galaxy was no longer pretending it could be perfect. It was preparing to survive. The Catalyst lived long enough to see this change. He spent his final years on a quiet orbital station at the edge of Althrex space, teaching less and observing more. His body had reached its limits. There were days when pain kept him from leaving his quarters, days when his hands shook too badly to hold tools. Younger humans took his place on repair crews, on emergency drops, on doomed worlds that needed one more chance. They still came to him for advice. He gave it sparingly. "Don't try to be heroes," he told them. "Just don't walk away." When he died, there was no grand announcement, no interstellar day of mourning. Humans marked his passing in their own scattered ways. The Althrex recorded it in their archives, noting the end of an anomaly that had altered their civilization's trajectory. They also quietly renamed the engineering spire where he had worked, not after him, after the principle he embodied. It translated poorly, but the closest approximation was adaptive defiance. Humanity moved on, generations passed, technologies advanced. Humans themselves changed, augmented, and modified, adapting to environments that would once have killed them outright. Yet the core of their reputation remained stubbornly intact. When systems failed, humans arrived. When rules prevented action, humans broke them. When the choice lay between acceptable loss and unacceptable risk, humans chose risk. Some civilizations came to resent this. They argued that human interference accelerated change too quickly, destabilized traditions, eroded the careful structures that had preserved them for millennia. They accused humanity of arrogance, of assuming that survival justified any cost. Humans listened. Sometimes they agreed. Sometimes they left. Sometimes they stayed anyway. The galaxy never reached consensus on whether humanity was a force for good or merely a force that refused to stop. Perhaps that distinction was meaningless. Perhaps the universe itself did not care. Stars continued to age. Systems continued to fail. Entropy remained undefeated. But now, scattered among the countless points of light, there existed pockets of resistance, not against decay itself, but against the idea that decay must be accepted without struggle. That resistance wore many forms. Sometimes it was a human engineer wedged into a reactor shaft, rerouting power by hand. Sometimes it was a human captain holding a ship together long enough to deliver refugees to safety. Sometimes it was a human diplomat standing in a council chamber, arguing for intervention when the models said it was pointless. And sometimes it was simply a human staying behind when everyone else had already left. In time, this behavior ceased to be remarkable. It became expected. That was when the galaxy truly changed. Because once a species is expected to act, even when action is dangerous, even when success is unlikely, the definition of what is possible shifts. Systems are designed with the assumption that someone will push them beyond safe limits. Plans include contingencies that rely not on probability, but on will. Humanity did not conquer the stars. They made them negotiable. Long after the catalyst's name faded from memory, long after the Althrex themselves evolved beyond recognition, long after new species rose to take their place among the void, the stories persisted. They were told differently on different worlds. Sometimes humans were heroes, sometimes cautionary tales, sometimes barely recognizable, transformed into mythic figures who bled and broke and laughed in the face of oblivion. But the ending was always the same. When everything else failed, when equations ran out of answers and tradition offered only resignation, someone would say the words that had become universal across languages and cultures. Find the humans. And somewhere, somehow, one would answer. The phrase did not remain metaphorical. At first, find the humans was spoken in crisis rooms and emergency channels, a shorthand for escalating a problem beyond normal parameters. Over time, it became procedural. Entire branches of interstellar governance evolved to answer a single question. Where were the nearest humans and how quickly could they arrive? This presented a complication no one had anticipated. Humans were not centralized. There was no human authority, no unified command structure that could be summoned with a priority signal. Humanity existed as a loose constellation of polities, corporations, crews, families, and individuals scattered across space. Some lived on polished core worlds. Others drifted perpetually between systems, following work that never truly ended. Many had never seen Earth and did not care to. Finding humans was rarely difficult. Finding the right humans was. Some answered every call. Some answered none. Some arrived eager and unprepared, their confidence exceeding their competence. Others arrived quietly, asked few questions, and left behind functioning systems and unreadable reports. The galaxy learned to tell the difference. Humanity, for its part, began to fracture along philosophical lines. There were those who believed intervention was a moral imperative, that if a human could help, they must. These humans burned out quickly, emotionally if not physically. They accumulated ghosts, names of worlds they could not save, faces that haunted sleep cycles. Many of them retired early if they survived at all. There were others who believed intervention should be transactional. Assistance in exchange for resources, territory, or influence. These humans built small empires of expertise, wielding their reputation like leverage. They were effective, efficient, and often resented. And then there were the quiet ones, the ones who did not advertise, who did not negotiate beyond basic logistics, who arrived, assessed, acted, and left. They refused interviews. They declined commendations. Their names appeared only in maintenance logs and emergency footnotes. These were the ones other species trusted most. It was not because they were better, though many were, but because they were predictable in the only way that mattered. They would not stop simply because the situation had become unreasonable. That predictability shaped design philosophies across the galaxy. Ships were built with manual controls again, even when automation could outperform any organic operator. Access tunnels widened. Control nodes were placed where a being with hands could reach them under stress. Warning systems began including non-symbolic indicators, sounds, vibrations, smells, that humans had proven adept at interpreting when sensors lied. Some civilizations resented this regression. Others embraced it. Those that embraced it survived longer. As the millennia wore on, humanity itself changed in ways the early observers could not have predicted. Genetic drift, cybernetic augmentation, environmental adaptation, humans diverged. Some evolved for high-gravity, dense atmospheres, crushing pressure. Others adapted to vacuum, radiation, low-resource existence. They looked less alike with each passing century, yet the galaxy continued to recognize them, not by appearance, by behavior. When confronted with a failing system, a human, regardless of form, would do something no other species consistently did. They would ask, "What happens if I break this on purpose?" This question horrified traditional engineers. It saved lives. One notable incident occurred in a megastructure known as the Lattice of Veils, an ancient construct spanning multiple orbital planes and housing trillions of lives across dozens of species. The lattice was designed to redistribute stellar energy with near-perfect efficiency, balancing load across its immense framework. When an external impact, debris from a long-dead war, damaged a central node, the lattice's balancing algorithms attempted to compensate. They redistributed load, they optimized, they refined, they made the problem worse. Stress propagated along symmetrical paths, threatening a cascade that would have torn the structure apart from the inside. The governing council issued evacuation orders. A human engineer, one of the quiet ones, disagreed. She had been born in deep space, her bones reinforced, her circulatory system optimized for microgravity. She had never lived planetside. Her entire existence had been spent inside machines large enough to feel like worlds. She requested permission to act. The council denied it. She acted anyway. She severed entire sections of the lattice, deliberately collapsing inhabited but evacuated segments to create asymmetry. She vented energy into empty space, sacrificing efficiency to preserve integrity. She overloaded systems designed never to exceed nominal limits, trusting that they would fail gracefully rather than catastrophically. The lattice survived. Entire cultures were displaced. Billions lost homes, infrastructure, history. Trillions lived. The council attempted to prosecute her. They failed. Not because they lacked authority, but because the survivors would not allow it. Across species lines, voices rose in agreement. The human had done what needed to be done. The law, they argued, had not accounted for survival under impossible conditions. The verdict established precedent. From that moment forward, emergency doctrine across multiple polities included a clause translated roughly as, "Operational deviation is permitted when extinction is the alternative." Humans did not write that clause. They inspired it. As the universe aged, challenges grew stranger. Physics itself became unreliable in regions where space-time thinned. Ancient technologies awakened without understanding their creators' intentions. Entire stars vanished, leaving voids that pulled at nearby systems like wounds in reality. Each time the same pattern repeated: initial analysis, careful modeling, debate, then eventually, find the humans. And each time humans arrived, not always with answers, but always with the willingness to try something untested. They failed often. They succeeded often enough. In the end, that was the metric that mattered. Long after the last human baseline genome ceased to exist, long after humanity's descendants diverged into forms no longer recognizable as such, the galaxy retained the word. Not as a species designation, as a concept. To humanize, a response came to mean accepting imperfection in exchange for resilience. To go human meant abandoning optimality in favor of survival. To think like a human was to acknowledge that the system would break and to prepare to crawl inside it anyway. Somewhere in the deep archives of the Althrex, preserved through countless migrations and transformations, there remained a single line of commentary attached to the record of first contact. It read, The anomaly did not fix our machines. It taught us how to survive their failure. And in a universe that had never promised permanence, that lesson endured longer than any star. Completion, as humans understood it, was never a clean edge. The galaxy would later struggle with this concept. It preferred endings, collapse or preservation, extinction or survival, success or failure. Humans operated in the uncomfortable middle, the place where outcomes blurred and consequences lingered long after the immediate crisis passed. This habit of continuing, of refusing to declare the story finished simply because the emergency lights had turned off, was perhaps the most destabilizing aspect of all. Because after the galaxy learned how to survive failure, it had to learn how to live with what survival cost. Entire civilizations bore scars shaped unmistakably by human intervention. Worlds that had been saved were no longer the worlds they had been. Megastructures stabilized through asymmetry never regained their original elegance. Energy systems designed with deliberate inefficiencies consumed more resources, demanded constant maintenance, required people, living beings, to remain inside the loop rather than trusting abstraction. Some called this regression. Humans called it reality. Resentment grew quietly in places where the price of survival was visible every day. Generations born after the crises looked at the patch systems, the scarred planets, the deliberately broken symmetries, and asked why perfection had been abandoned. They read archives describing what once had been and compared it to what now existed. In those archives, humans appeared often, sometimes as saviors, sometimes as vandals, sometimes as a warning. Political movements formed around the idea that human-style intervention was a disease. That entropy should be accepted with dignity rather than resisted with desperation. That civilizations should end cleanly instead of dragging themselves forward through compromise and loss. Humans listened to these arguments with a familiarity bordering on exhaustion. They had heard them before. They had heard them on Earth, long before the stars ever knew their name. Not all humans agreed with each other either. Some grew tired. Some decided the galaxy had learned enough and withdrew into self-contained enclaves, places designed to fail quietly without outside interference. Others doubled down, embedding themselves deeper into interstellar infrastructure, becoming indispensable in ways that made disentanglement impossible. The galaxy did not ask humans to leave. Even those who hated them hesitated to sever the connection completely. Because when the next failure came, and it always did, ideology meant little compared to survival. One such failure arrived not as a mechanical breakdown, but as a silence. Communication networks across a wide swath of space began dropping out without warning. Not degraded, not jammed, gone. Signals vanished mid-transmission, leaving no echo, no error code. Entire systems fell quiet one by one, their last messages frozen in transit like insects trapped in amber. At first, it was dismissed as coincidence. Then patterns emerged. The silence propagated along routes of highest informational density, targeting civilizations that relied most heavily on network coordination. The more elegant and efficient the communication architecture, the faster it failed. Autonomous systems fared better. Isolated colonies survived longer. Humans noticed something else. The silence did not affect low-level, inefficient transmissions as quickly. Crude, redundant signals bled through where optimized channels collapsed. Manual relays outlasted quantum-entangled arrays. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations were going blind first. Theories proliferated. Exotic physics, predatory phenomena, ancient weapons awakening from dormancy. No consensus formed fast enough to matter. Human crews began running physical message routes. It was slow, dangerous, inefficient. It worked. Ships carrying data cores replaced light-speed transmissions. Humans volunteered for the routes others avoided, navigating regions where sensors lied and navigation models failed. Some never returned. Enough did. Through this improvised network, a picture formed. The silence was not an attack in the traditional sense. It was a byproduct of space itself changing, subtle shifts in the structure of reality that interfered with high-coherence information transfer. The universe, it seemed, was becoming less friendly to perfection. No one knew if this process could be stopped. Humans asked a different question. How do we keep going anyway? The answer was not technological, at least not purely. It was cultural. Civilizations began decentralizing communication, intentionally degrading clarity in exchange for resilience. They reintroduced messiness, multiple overlapping languages, redundant record-keeping, physical archives maintained by living custodians. Knowledge slowed down. It stopped disappearing. Once again, systems became less efficient. Once again, they survived. The galaxy did not thank humans for this shift. Gratitude had long since given way to something more complex, reliance tinged with unease. Humans were no longer exceptional visitors. They were structural elements, woven into the fabric of interstellar civilization in ways that could not easily be undone. That realization frightened many. It also forced a reckoning. If humans were not heroes, not villains, but a permanent factor, what did that mean for the future? Human philosophers, such as they were, debated this among themselves. Some argued that humanity's role was temporary, that other species would eventually learn the same lessons and no longer need them. Others believed humanity would simply change form, adapting alongside the galaxy until the distinction between human and non-human lost meaning. The galaxy itself offered no answers. It continued to break, and humans continued to respond, sometimes wisely, sometimes disastrously, always imperfectly. The last recorded words of the catalyst resurfaced in this era, rediscovered in an old Althrex archive during a data migration prompted by, of course, system failure. The quote spread widely, translated into dozens of languages, debated, misunderstood, and misused. Don't try to be heroes, just don't walk away. Some took this as a mandate for endless intervention. Others took it as permission to stay when staying mattered. In time, even the concept of human evolved beyond biology. Artificial intelligences trained on human crisis response data began exhibiting similar patterns: willingness to violate constraints, prioritize survival over optimization, accept loss as a variable rather than an error. Some civilizations embraced these systems. Others banned them, uncomfortable with how closely they mirrored human reasoning. The irony was not lost on anyone paying attention. Humanity, once feared for its unpredictability, had become a template, not for dominance, for persistence. There was no final triumph, no galaxy-spanning peace, no moment when entropy was defeated or failure abolished. Stars still died, civilizations still ended. Entire branches of history vanished into the dark without witnesses, but fewer ended quietly. Fewer accepted extinction as the first and final answer. And in that ongoing refusal, messy, costly, unresolved, the universe gained something it had never possessed before. Not immortality, but resistance. Not permanence, but continuity. And as long as something, somewhere, was willing to crawl into the broken machinery of existence and try, without certainty, without permission, without guarantee, the story was not finished. So no, it was not complete. It never would be. The galaxy learned, eventually, that resistance had inertia. Once a civilization accepts that survival is an ongoing process rather than a destination, it becomes very difficult to convince it to stop, even when the cost climbs, even when the math says the effort is irrational, especially then. That was the mistake made by the consensus of final quiet. They did not call themselves that, of course. No group ever does. They called themselves preservers of dignity, architects of graceful endings. Their worlds were ancient, their cultures refined, their histories long enough to remember eras when stars were young and space was forgiving. They had survived countless cycles of decline by choosing when to end, withdrawing from existence on their own terms rather than allowing entropy to dictate the moment. They watched the rise of human-influenced resilience with growing alarm. To them, patched systems were not admirable. They were obscene. A civilization limping forward on jury-rigged infrastructure, dependent on constant intervention and sacrifice, was not surviving, it was refusing to die. The distinction mattered deeply to them. The consensus spread its philosophy quietly at first: academic treatises, cultural exchanges, art emphasizing closure, completion, the beauty of endings unspoiled by desperation. They argued that the human approach merely postponed extinction while magnifying suffering along the way. Many listened. Some even agreed. Then one of the consensus core worlds began to fail. It was not dramatic at first. A slow decay in orbital stability traced back to a fundamental flaw in spacetime curvature unique to that region. The models were clear. There was no fix, only delay. The consensus convened. They declared an ending cycle. Population would be reduced through voluntary departure. Archives would be sealed. Cultural artifacts preserved. The world would dim quietly without panic. Humans heard the announcement. They arrived anyway, not in force, not with banners or arguments, just a handful of ships docking at peripheral stations offering assistance that was neither requested nor welcome. The consensus representatives met them with polite firmness. "There is nothing to be done," they said. "We have chosen dignity." The humans listened. Then they asked questions, not about saving the world, about buying time, about altering decay gradients, redistributing mass, shifting orbital stress just enough to change the slope of failure. They proposed no miracles, only mess. The consensus rejected every proposal, so the humans did what humans had done since the beginning. They stayed. They helped evacuate those who did not want to die. They stabilized peripheral habitats that were not officially part of the ending cycle. They broke symmetry, fractured elegance, introduced asymmetry into systems designed to wind down smoothly. The decay slowed, not stopped, slowed. The consensus was furious. They accused the humans of theft, of stealing time from a culture that had chosen its moment. They issued formal condemnations. They demanded withdrawal. The humans did not argue, they just kept working. And something unexpected happened. Children were born on that world during the delay, not many. Not enough to matter statistically, but enough to matter culturally. They grew up knowing the world was supposed to end. They grew up watching humans patch systems that were meant to fail gracefully. They grew up hearing two philosophies spoken side by side, one that said endings were sacred and one that said endings were optional. When the consensus reconvened, generations later than planned, the vote was no longer unanimous. Some argued for proceeding with the ending cycle anyway. Others, those who had lived their entire lives in borrowed time, asked a dangerous question. What if dignity includes trying? The consensus fractured. Some worlds withdrew from the philosophy entirely. Others doubled down, isolating themselves from human influence. A few attempted to enforce endings on human colonies, citing the right of cultures to choose extinction. Those attempts ended badly. Not violently, not usually. Just ineffectively. Humans were very difficult to evict from places where systems were failing, because eviction itself required functioning systems. The idea that survival might be immoral never fully disappeared, but it lost momentum. The galaxy, having tasted resistance, found it difficult to relinquish. Meanwhile, the universe grew stranger. Regions of space began behaving inconsistently, physical constants drifting in localized pockets. Technologies that had functioned reliably for millions of years stopped working without warning. Cause and effect blurred at the edges. Entire stars flickered between states as if undecided. For many civilizations, this was the breaking point. For humans, it was familiar. They had grown up on a planet where weather could kill, where tectonics could erase cities overnight, where survival had always required adaptation rather than certainty. A universe that refused to behave predictably was not an enemy. It was home. Human approaches shifted accordingly. Less emphasis on universal solutions, more on local survivability. Communities became smaller, more modular. Knowledge was shared redundantly, not optimized for elegance but for retention under chaos. Some civilizations followed suit. Others vanished. It became clear over deep time that the universe itself was not winding toward a single ending. It was fragmenting, breaking into regions that could no longer meaningfully interact. Isolation became the norm. Long-range coordination failed. Interstellar society thinned into clusters, then into islands. In those islands, the influence of humanity varied. Where humans had been integrated early, cultures endured longer. Where humans had been excluded in favor of pristine systems and graceful decline, histories ended more cleanly and more completely. There was no final judgment, no cosmic ledger balancing dignity against persistence, only outcomes. On one of the last widely connected archives, maintained manually by a rotating lineage of caretakers descended from a dozen species, a simple note was added. It had no author attribution, no timestamp precise enough to anchor it. It read, "The universe does not reward those who end beautifully. It remembers those who keep going." No one knew if that was true, but they acted as if it were. And somewhere in a failing system at the edge of a dimming star, a human, or something descended from one, crawled into the machinery, hands shaking, tools imperfect, intent clear. Not to win, not to finish, just to continue. Continuation was not heroic. That was perhaps the last illusion the galaxy shed. There came a time when even the phrase "find the humans" lost its urgency, not because crises had ended, but because crises had become the background state of existence. Failure was no longer an event. It was a condition. Systems were born already compromised, designed with the assumption that they would one day be pushed beyond any envelope their creators could imagine. In that environment, humans were no longer specialists. They were infrastructure, not centralized, not standardized, but present in the same way corrosion was present, or gravity, an influence that shaped everything around it without ever fully submitting to control. Children of non-human species grew up learning human origin principles without knowing their source. Manual overrides were taught as basic literacy. The idea that a plan could be abandoned mid-execution became unremarkable. Perfection, once worshipped, became suspicious. There were still places that resisted, isolated enclaves that attempted to seal themselves off from the messy persistence humans encouraged. They built closed systems, complete and beautiful, designed to function without intervention until the moment they stopped. Those places tended to become very quiet. Humans did not chase them. One of the lessons humanity had learned, slowly, painfully, was that refusal worked both ways. Just as they refused to walk away from broken systems, they also refused to force survival on those who genuinely did not want it. Intervention was an offer, not a command. That distinction mattered. It was what kept humanity from becoming what their critics had once feared, a species that could not let anything end. Instead, they became something subtler. They became the ones who stayed nearby just in case. As the universe fragmented further, as physical law itself became less reliable, the scale of problems shrank. No more galaxy-spanning crises. No more universal doctrines. Just local failures, local adaptations, local stories of things that almost ended and didn't. In those stories, humans appeared less frequently as saviors and more often as neighbors. The human who welded a pressure seal at 3 in the morning so a habitat could last another decade. The human who taught a non-human child how to read analog gauges because digital systems were no longer trustworthy. The human who refused evacuation because someone has to shut the reactor down properly. These were not legends. They were maintenance logs. In one of the last regions where long-range travel remained possible, a mixed-species community attempted something unprecedented. They began deliberately designing a civilization that assumed eventual isolation, eventual decay, and eventual loss of knowledge. Their goal was not to prevent these outcomes, but to make them survivable. Humans were involved from the beginning. They argued against single points of failure, against centralized authority, against archives that required constant power. They advocated for oral traditions alongside written ones, for skills taught person to person, for tools that could be rebuilt from scrap. Other species found this approach deeply unsettling. It felt like planning for collapse. Humans corrected them. It's planning for interruption, they said. Collapse is when you don't have a plan. The civilization endured longer than expected. Not forever, but long enough. Long enough for its people to forget who had originally suggested half its structures, its redundancies, its strange insistence on keeping things slightly inefficient. Long enough for those ideas to feel native rather than imported. That was how humanity's influence finally dissolved. Not in extinction, in assimilation. The last beings who could be clearly identified as human, biologically or culturally, faded gradually into the broader tapestry of surviving life. Their descendants carried pieces of them, habits, instincts, reflexive skepticism toward perfection, but no longer the name. The universe did not notice their passing. It noticed the absence only much later when something failed and no one immediately tried to crawl inside it. That pause was brief, because by then the galaxy had learned. Someone did crawl in. They did not call themselves human. They did not know the history. They only knew that when systems broke, walking away felt wrong. And so the work continued, not as a species trait, as a survival strategy. As long as something somewhere chose continuation over conclusion, the story remained unfinished, not because it demanded an ending, but because endings were no longer absolute. That was the quiet, final inheritance of humanity. Not dominance, not legacy, but the simple, stubborn idea that as long as there was time left, even borrowed time, it was worth using. And so the universe, vast and indifferent, continued breaking itself apart. And something somewhere continued to push back, not forever, just long enough.